start with a couple of quotes and a photograph. This is a photograph of Susan Pringle Frost late in life. In this picture, she's in the Joseph Manigault house looking out the window at that very beautiful lodge out in the yard. She was self-deprecating, and she said that in her later life, she looked like a house on two legs. And she was a determined woman. But Thomas Waring, you see his quote on the screen, describing her as a sort of tugboat Annie personality, short, buxom, fast-talking in the Charleston patois, and accustomed to pushing causes. And then her own self-assessment, that she hates to be stuck off in a corner, she likes to be doing things, and she certainly did a great deal. Susan Pringle Frost was born in 1873 in her ancestral home, the Miles Bruton House at 27 King Street. That is a picture of her on the left. In her childhood, she grew up in the Miles Bruton House with her grandparents, her parents, her siblings, her aunt Susan Pringle, for whom she was named. And so she grew up completely surrounded by a sense of history, a sense of the importance of Charleston's architecture. The Miles Bruton House was built in the mid-18th century, one of the most important houses in the city of Charleston, both for its architectural detail and its history, and the fact that it's remained in the family of Miles Bruton and his descendants up to the present day. And she was also born into a family of great privilege, and that gave her a lot of opportunity to do some things that were a little bit eccentric in her life and still be taken seriously. The Miles Bruton House, Susan Pringle Frost's mother was Rebecca Pringle, and her grandmother. And this is her her family tree looking back to Robert Bruton, whose father was Miles Bruton. So the family lineage back to Miles Bruton House was through the Bruton family, then into the Mott family, and then into the Alston family. And the Jacob Mott House is a house at 61 Tradd that will be on tour. It was one of the houses that she restored. The Frost family, her father's family, their family house was at the corner of Logan and Tradd, and 4 Logan Street, which was owned by the Frost family, was also on tour, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the Miles Bruton House is a very important house, and it's here that she learns about the sense of Charleston's history, this nostalgia. Some people have looked back on her career and thought that she looked at things through a, quote, golden haze of memory. And it's hard not to appreciate that by looking at that house in which she grew up. One of the important influences in her life was her aunt, Susan Pringle. She was basically a nanny to Susan Pringle Frost and her siblings, and was very interested in family history. Susan Pringle Frost went to school on LeGree Street, a private school run by the Murden sisters, and I believe it was at 23 LeGree Street. And then she went off for 2 years to private school in Raleigh, North Carolina, the St. Mary's School. She did not get a degree, but she took some general classes in French and art and all kinds of things that sort of were typical of a finishing school experience. She then comes back to Charleston, and in 1891, she comes back to Charleston. She's 18 years old. This is the same year that her parents purchased 4 Logan Street. It's her father's family house, but he purchases the house outright. It's the only house her parents ever owned. And she lives here from 1891 until 1919. So this becomes not only her parents' home, but Susan Pringle Frost's home for some 28 years. So when she starts the preservation movement in Charleston in the early 1900s, this is where she's living. She's also a debutante. It's hard to imagine house on legs as she describes herself, but she was a debutante and had her debut as part of the St. Cecilia Society, which is the highest level in Charleston of that social world. Her father was Dr. Francis Frost, Frank Frost. He was Civil War. Her family lost their fortunes in the Civil War, but the Frost and Pringle families both, they had rice plantations on the Santee River. And Frank Frost attempted to revive the family's fortunes by cultivating those rice plantations. Ultimately was not successful. He later was able to have some financial success running a phosphate business, and that money allowed them to buy 4 Logan Street. That business failed. Hurricane of 1893 essentially wiped out the phosphate industry and moved down to Florida. So in 1895, her father has to sign over basically all of his possessions to creditors and go to work as the city health officer for the city of Charleston. And that moment of losing their property, or having to sign it off to creditors, they actually kept ownership, but was one that she remembered for many, many years, and she often found herself in debt, and maybe didn't learn that lesson very well. But for the first 5 years or so of her working career, she had a job as a typist in a law office. She had to go to work to help provide some income for the family and to give herself a little bit of independence. She really chafed under the social norms of the day. She was not interested in playing the piano and doing house calls. She wanted to get out and work. But her first real job was a really important job. She was a personal secretary to Bradford Lee Gilbert. Gilbert was an architect who was in charge of the design of the South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition that was held up at what's now Hampton Park. So Hampton Park is the setting for that event. And part of her role in that was, well, Bradford Gilbert lived in New York. He was a New York architect. He did buy a house on South Battery, but he was often in New York. And so her job would be to relay messages from Gilbert to the contractors, to the people on the ground. So she was constantly going up and relaying messages, and she said that the people working at the site thought she knew all this stuff about architecture and construction. She had no idea what she was talking about. She said she could just tell them things from the architect Gilbert, but she learned a lot. This is where, for these 2 years she worked with Gilbert, this is where she learned about architecture, this is where she learned about design, this is where she learned about construction. And she also was able to get a sense of the possibilities of architecture, what could become, what Charleston could be like. The other important outcome of her experience with the exposition is that part of the putting on the program at the expo were groups of women. And she was very involved in different networks of women that put on different aspects of this exposition. And out of that comes her interest in women's rights and suffrage that she then nurtures a little bit later on. So the next phase of her career, after this 1902, the exposition ends in June 1902, she applies for a competitive job, and she becomes a stenographer for the United States District Court, which is a pretty good job. She's very frustrated because she's paid less than men, but she does this from 1902 till 1918. So for 16 years, she's a court stenographer for the U.S. District Court. And it's a grueling work schedule. She's dealing with thousands of pages of transcripts that she has to type. She's up until 1 or 2 in the morning. Many times during the week, she's traveling. The judges travel over a 3-state area. And so she's always moving around and trying to keep up with her workload. But through the process of sitting through all these court depositions and trials, she begins to build a sense of social awareness of some of the problems in society. One thing that angers her, and this is a little bit of nativism, is that, and this is by about 1915, and by 1915 she owns about 15 houses. She says, I don't understand why my family has contributed to the history of this country, has built this city, and I own 15 houses, and I don't have the right to vote because I'm a woman. But she says, but some immigrant of the lowest class can come here, and in 7 years that man has the right to vote. She says that's not fair. So in a way, she's an advocate for women's rights, but she's also reacting a little bit to the immigration waves that are coming into the country in the early 20th century. But her experience with the court system's raising her social awareness, and also her father as chief health inspector for the city is going off into the slum areas of Charleston. And he's seeing all the problems and reporting those back to city council. And she's hearing about what's going on in some of the parts of the city that were some of those areas that were not desirable were places like Trad Street, St. Michael's Alley, Elliott Street, Eden's Alley, East Bay Street, the waterfront, places where she did most of her preservation work. It's a combination of her father, her experience at the exposition, and her work as a stenographer that gave her a sense of some of the social needs that needed to be met, that could be met through working for women's rights and also working for historic preservation and some other causes. She was a supporter of Mayor Grace, and this put her again a little bit on the outside. Mayor Grace was a very flamboyant Irish immigrant mayor who was not popular with Charleston's elite. But Mayor Grace implemented most of her father's recommendations, and so she really liked Mayor Grace. One of her father's recommendations was to get rid of all the cows on the peninsula. Mayor Grace got rid of all the cows on the peninsula because they were hell-hazard, or as they saw it back then. And she said that Mayor Grace always stood with preservationists, and so she was a real fan of Mayor Grace. But this also shows a little bit of her willingness to be politically independent in the conservative world in which she lives. In 1919, she becomes chair of the Civic Club City Betterment Committee, and she's working, again, these are her causes, unsanitary housing, improving things like the waiting rooms in the train station, cleaner streets. So she has a sense of, I need to make my city better, and some of that comes from her father. She's the first president of the Charleston Equal Suffrage League in 1914, and they have their early meetings at 4 Logan Street at her home. So this is a picture of the Equal Suffrage League on the steps of 4 Logan Street. So 4 Logan Street is going to be a really good place for us to talk about Susan Pringle Frost's antecedents, her early career, and her involvement with women's suffrage, because a lot of that takes place here. In fact, she moves out of 4 Logan in 1919. By 1918, 1919 is the year that women get the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. So it's a nice kind of terminus to that story there. But she's a dogged supporter of women's rights, and she allies herself with some of the most militant feminists of that period of time. She helps to organize meetings in Charleston. 1915, they had basically street protests and set up booths on the corner of Broad Street, a couple places advocating for women's rights. So she's really involved in that. And in 1919, when they do finally vote in the United States Senate to pass the amendment, both the South Carolina senators voted in favor of women's right to vote and passing that amendment, and that's partly attributable to her work. There was a photograph on the cover of the magazine, The Suffragists, from 1915, of the Charleston Equal Suffrage League presenting Congressman Whaley with a petition in support of women's rights. So 4 Logan Street is a pretty important place in the history of women's history, as well as Susan Pringle Frost's life. Her motto was quote, "By the help of God, I will leap over the wall." She was always looking at a hurdle ahead of her, but she knew that she would be able to get across it. In 1919, her Aunt Susan Pringle died, I believe it was in 1917, and they had to wrap up the estate. But the Miles Bruton house had essentially become heirs' property. And Susan and her 2 sisters decide that they want to own this property outright. And so they go to, her sister Rebecca worked for the DuPont family as their sort of nursemaid to their children. And she goes to the DuPonts and she gets a loan to be able to buy out all of the other heirs. So she gets DuPont money to be able to buy out her relatives. And so the 3 sisters take ownership of Miles Bruton House in 1919. So they move out of 4 Logan Street, 30 years of accumulation. They move all that stuff into 27 King Street. And this is where she lives until she dies in 1960. And they sell 4 Logan Street to help pay off some of the debt to the DuPont family. And she's constantly, as she goes to pioneering in every sense of the word, but she was looking to make money. And she did things to buildings that we wouldn't necessarily support if it were to go to the BAR today. But she was part in the early 1900s, 1909, when she started, was when Murray Boulevard was being created. The seawall was being put in, the mud flats were being filled, and new buildings were going up. She wanted to be part of that. And so the first two properties that she purchases are at basically adjacent to those mud flats at the end of Trad Street, 146 Trad Street. This house is not here anymore. But there was a major effort to invest in this part of the city. The city's leadership was involved. This was sort of going to be the bright future of Charleston, and she wanted to be a part of that. And her way to be a part of that was to buy these houses at the end of Trad Street. One of the things she liked about Trad Street was that the street stretched from one side of the peninsula to the other, and you could see the river at both ends. And she thought that, she recognized that in the areas in which she worked, on Trad, on St. Michael's Alley, Beaton's Alley, she did some houses on King Street, East Bay. This is the old walled city. This is the oldest part of Charleston. This is colonial Charleston. This was, Trad Street was the most important street at that period of time. Very important houses. Her ancestors lived in this part of the city, and it was a slum. It was a slum. No one wanted to live here. All the houses in this area, for the most part, rental properties, low-income rental properties, poorly maintained, largely African-American. She does these two houses, but she says she's not real interested this end of Trad Street, so she moves down the street. This is a picture of Trad Street about the time when she starts to get involved, and you can see that it's still paved, cobblestones and brick, trash along the streets, not a lot of green, buildings in some rough condition. A little sweet shop here that's been demolished at 63 Trad Street. And she starts to get to work. This is a photograph of 8, 10, and 12 Trad Street in September 1960. 8 Trad is on our tour. What she's doing in buying these houses is she's going in a direction that no one else is going in Charleston. People look at what she's doing and they say, you're making a mistake, you're throwing your money away, you're never going to get your money back. And she generally sells the houses that she buys at a loss. She's not making money. She's losing money. She lost $6,000 on 61 Trad Street, which is a huge amount of money in the 1920s. And she's, again, heavily reliant on money from DuPont's to back her up. She calls what she's doing pyramiding. She buys a house, leverages it, buys another house. What she was doing was the same thing that a revolving fund does. Buy a house, fix it up, sell it, do another one. But she would get in over her head, and she never really had a really good business sense, but always had this backstop kind of holding her up. But as some have looked back on her career and her investing in real estate, they've said that one of her accomplishments was that she was basically buying time for these buildings, holding on to them, so that they could be restored by others. In some cases, she had a vision. She bought almost the entire block that became Rainbow Road, but she ended up really only restoring one of those. She had to sell them off to other people because she couldn't keep them going. So she was always making compromises, and she was making choices. And one person that I really want to point out to you is a man named Thomas Mayhem Pinckney. Thomas Pinckney was an African-American contractor who did almost all of her work. And when Pinckney died in the 1950s, she wrote a letter to the editor and said that while she gets all the credit for the work that she did, he did all the physical work. And Pinckney trained as a maker of stairs, built stairways, but he also then became far more skilled at making reproduction mantles and things like that. And what Susan Pringle Frost would she would sit and type letters all the time, all kinds of people, the newsletters to the editor about everything from preservation to animal cruelty. And some of the letters were kind of wonky, and you look at those letters and you can just see her just feverishly typing. She did this well into her 1950s. She sent letters to the editor, but she was never afraid of giving her opinion on something and didn't care what people thought. People respected her for being a principal. And that is sort of built into the DNA of the Preservation Society, which comes about a little bit later. But in 1916, she's started to invest on the eastern end of Trad Street, 8, 10, and 12 Trad. One of the things in talking about her attitude toward architecture is, if you look at this 8 and 10 Trad today, you see this arch and two windows, and an arch. This is what it looked like. It was, these were, almost all the houses on Trad Street were built as commercial properties on the ground floor with residential above. And this is a traditional sort of retail arrangement on the ground floor with two large windows that are shop windows and a double door at the front. Same thing here, and smaller windows upstairs for the residential space. What she did on almost every house was change the doors and windows, particularly on the ground floor, to make it look more residential. So understand that she did things physically to building. When you look at Trad Street today, it's very beautiful, but it's also seen a pretty significant amount of change, particularly on the street level. A couple other houses, this is from her scrapbook that we have upstairs, showing houses like 12 Trad. The balcony on it is this wooden replacement balcony that looks like it's about to fall off. One of the things Susan Frost was very interested in doing was saving iron balconies. And she'd take them from other places. The one that's on 54 Trad came from State Street. And if she didn't have a place to put stuff, she put it in her yard. And she ended up filling up her outbuilding with all kinds of stuff. Mantles, cobblestones, wrought iron gates, balconies, all kinds of stuff. Some cases, balconies from East Bay were in her yard for over 20 years. She'd bury the cobblestones with leaves. She'd have people go get cobblestones if she'd see one on the street because she could lift them. And so she accumulated all of this stuff. So she became essentially a warehouse of material that she would then put wherever she felt like it would fit. Again, it was the spirit was there, but it wasn't exactly as scholarly as we might sort of want it to be today. So she would replace this balcony with one that she found elsewhere. There was a movement in the preservation community that starts to build around her work, particularly in the 1920s, late 20s, early 30s, where people from New York, people from Philadelphia, people from up north that have a lot of money were buying bits and pieces of Charleston buildings to put on their own buildings elsewhere. And so whole rooms were being sold out of historic buildings. In the case of the William Burroughs house on Broad Street, the entire house was purchased and dismantled, but actually never put back up anywhere else. So she was very concerned about making sure that this stuff wasn't leaving Charleston. She has no hesitation to move it around Charleston. She didn't want to leave Charleston. And so 6 Trad again. 61 Trad, the Jacob Mott house, her ancestral house. One of the reasons why she bought this house was the ancestral connection. Another reason was because it had some beautiful woodwork on the inside. She sold the house, and the subsequent owner sold the woodwork to the Art Museum in St. Louis. She was very, very upset about that. In fact, in the 1920s, she proposed an ordinance to City Council that protected historic interiors. Before we ever had a zoning ordinance, the first ordinance that's proposed for preservation in Charleston comes from Susan Frost, and it's about historic woodwork. And so she was as interested in the interiors of these houses as she was in what they look like on the outside. She respected what was there, and if it wasn't there, she added it to make it look a certain way. But 61 Trad has lost that historic interior, so there's some information about that that would be important to talk about in 61 Trad. Was her interest in saving woodwork. Let's see, 54 Trad. This was the house. This is the house that was the one of the earliest postmasters' houses in Charleston. It does retain this fenestration on the ground level. This is where she gets the balcony and puts She created a new way for herself to get into debt by advocating for streets being paved, because she was always in debt to the city to pay for her paving that was done out front of her houses. After working on Trad Street, this is some of the paving on Trad, Elizabeth O'Neill Verner comes and she does an etching of 54 Trad after it's been restored by Susan Pringle Frost with the balcony that came from State Street. But this neighborhood becomes an inspiration for the Charleston Renaissance. It's a great house. Before I jump to St. Michael's Alley, this is another example of this is not a house that she worked on, but just preservation ethic in that era. If you look at the house today, and it has this arched doorway and this, really decorative looking early 19th century door surround, none of that's actually historic. The original appearance of this piece was as a commercial structure, again, 2 shop windows and a shop door that basically been blown over for a garage. We would no more allow people to put garage doors in the front of their houses downtown today. But it was what was done. It was to accommodate the automobile, and it reflects the social status of a lot of the people that were buying these houses in this neighborhood at the time. They had cars. So you go from houses that had basically all kinds of no plumbing, no heating, no air conditioning, slum conditions, to vacation houses for people from up north who had to park their cars, and they were finding room for the cars. St. Michael's Alley, this is a photograph about 1920 taken by Alice Radnor G. Smith, showing the houses at 4, 6, and 8 St. Michael's Alley, which is just around the corner from the church. This is a later view by George Johnson about 1940 that shows that the fabric itself has not changed too much. It looks a little bit more respectable. This is a photograph that she took in 1913 when she moved into this area. So this is 4, this is 6, and this is 8. She makes some changes on the ground floor. Again, as I said, she doesn't respect doors and windows too much, but is converting multifamily into single family, converting commercial spaces into residential spaces. This is another view of 4, 6, and 8 Trad Street from her photo album, showing it after restoration. You'll notice here that there are 2 doors and a window before, and after there's just 1 door and 2 windows, but she does leave the threshold, and we can look for that when we get out St. Michael's.
Is that a big lot where houses burned down, where the picture was taken from? Across? Where did that?
Across the, I don't know, we'll have to look and see what's there. I don't know. I think it was a vacant lot where those houses were built.
It was a cotton warehouse first, and then the hydraulic
Press.
Warehouse
Okay.
across the street.
And that's roughly where they built that. DuBose Hayward built his house, and there's a couple other houses built about 1913, so that makes sense. So yes, a vacant lot. And this is an after, and she's proud of showing off the bracket and the lamp that she had put on there. This is a photograph from 1940. But 8 St. Michael's Alley was what she said was her favorite house. 61 Trad was the biggest house she ever did. 8 St. Michael's was her favorite. 8 St. Michael's was designed by Edward Brickell White, who was a Charleston antebellum architect. It was designed for James Lewis Pettigrew, a unionist lawyer, as his law office. And when Pettigrew's house burns in 1860 or 61, he moves in here as his home and dies about a year later. But it's a very, very interesting building. It's a little bit, it wasn't built in the latest style. It was built about 1850. But it was a simple, classical building built as a law office. And interestingly, the DuPont family helped fund her. This is now owned by descendants of those DuPonts who helped her in her restoration work. This is a photograph from 1940 showing the after, again, the balconies and the gates and things that she's added to it. It's a remarkable building. There's a quote that I'll share with you about the house. It talks a little bit about what she did to it. She says, I kept this house intact even to the bookcases in the library on the 2nd floor. The front door was so far gone that the contractor refused to repair it, so I had it sent to the mill and duplicated. And while she starts doing the work in 1913, she doesn't sell any houses until 1918. She kind of overextends herself, gets 2018, Susan Pringle Frost quits her job as court stenographer, opens her business on Broad Street. She rents 9 Broad Street as her first office. She sells a house, makes a lot of money, buys a car, then buys 57 Broad Street as her permanent office, which she owns until the 1950s. She's the first woman to own her own business on Broad Street. And again, she's just looked at like she has, antlers growing out of her head for doing that at that time period. So she's starts selling her houses on St. Michael's Alley. Her next area of interest that she moves into is East Bay Street, and this is a photograph of East Bay Street about the same time period when she gets interested. Notice that most of the street level along East Bay Street is commercial. Big picture windows, Victorian storefront details, double doors all the way up and down the street. No trees, very barren, very commercial, very sort of rundown waterfront looking housing and buildings. These buildings always had residential properties upstairs, but commercial on the ground floor. See this regular doors and windows and windows and doors. You don't see an arch anywhere along East Bay Street. This is a photograph from 1940, still not a lot of progress being made. Susan Pringle Frost really struggles with her East Bay properties. She has to sell them off one by one. She gets almost the whole block and holds on to 83, the longest. But they slowly get restored. And as they do, you notice that these little arches start appearing and little garage doors and things like that. So as you walk down Rainbow Road, you see arches and things. That's all been added later. So lots of change going on despite, the preservation of these buildings is a wonderful story, and it was inspiring to so many people, but the physical changes being made, I think that's important to emphasize. In 1920, the Joseph Manigault house is threatened with demolition. She doesn't have the money to do anything about it. It's all the way up beyond Calhoun Street, the neighborhood that most people aren't thinking about at that time. And so she realizes that if she's going to save this, she needs more people to help. And so the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings is created, which becomes the Preservation Society of Charleston. They buy the house. They turn it over to her cousin, her Pringle cousins, Ernest and Nell Pringle, who then soon saddle themselves with a $40,000 debt on this house for years and years and years. They were very bitter when they were finally able to, they were going to lose it to foreclosure, and the heir of the A&P fortune, Princess Pignatelli, stepped in and bought it for a few $1,000s and gave it to the Charleston Museum. What the Pringles resented was that in the late 20s, while they were stuck with this house that they were trying to maintain and open to the public, and was that the society got involved with the Hayward Washington house in the late 1920s. And that was much more popular in the community as a community preservation effort because of George Washington's association with the house and Thomas Hayward's association with the house as a sign of the Declaration of Independence. And so the Pringles didn't understand why Susan Frost suddenly changed her focus as well as the organization's focus to that house. But ultimately both houses were saved. Another project that she got involved with was the Planters Inn. And there used to be a marker up that recognized that she was the leading light in Charleston that sought to save what was the Planters Hotel and had it converted to the Dock Street Theater with WPA money in the 1930s. It's not about the Preservation Society of Charleston tour. And so her later life is very involved with the Preservation Society. She gets very involved with the zoning ordinance. She's on the Board of Zoning Adjustments until 1949. She's constantly writing letters, agitating, going to meetings, giving talks, things like that about the Preservation Society. But she starts to wind down her own real estate businesses. She's still holding some property as late as 1940 that she's trying to get out of. But as she gets older, she begins to retreat into 27 King Street, into the Miles Bruton house. The last real campaign that she gets involved with is trying to save the Charleston Orphan House and the Orphan House Chapel on Calhoun Street, which was unsuccessful. But she would write really sort of very pointed letters to the editor and letters to people that this was torn down to make way for Sears, and she'd write to the head of Sears and just say, basically, who do you think you are to do this? she had to make a change to it, if she had to take a window out and move something around, she did it. She was trying to get the job done with almost nothing to work with except some money that she continually was sort of scraping up from her own transactions and the loans from the DuPont family. But I think her most important preservation legacy, of course, is the existence of this organization today that we're thankfully volunteering for, and we continue to do our work that we think she'd be proud of, and the preservation of the Miles Bruton House is it still remains in her family. So she never married, had no children. She was a quirky person who would drive around in her car, go down the wrong way on one-way streets, and she'd take her dogs with her all the time. So people knew she was coming around the corner, and they could hear her coming because her car was old and make a lot of noise. But kind of like that about her. So that's a quick run through her life. There's a lot to talk about. You can learn more than you possibly remember. Sidney Bland wrote a book about Susan Pringle Frost's life and times, and this is really the definitive work to go to. We do sell it here in the shop. And Sidney Bland worked with the Society many years ago in putting this book together, used things in our archives, and did a lot of really good work putting this together. So it's there's really no better account of her life than this book. So just recommend it just as general reading about Charles. Puts a new perspective on things that we might take for granted otherwise. And lots of good anecdotes and quotes from her and other people about her. But an important woman